everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of the Environment Office's nuclear webinar series. My name is April, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation Environment Office. I'm from Saugeen First Nation, and I've been with the office for almost 4 years now, and I'm responsible for planning many of the events and functions that come out of the office. So I'd like to thank you all for signing up and joining us today. We are presenting this webinar series every other Wednesday, but today we had to reschedule from last week. But moving forward, next week we'll go back to the every other week schedule. So again, we're just trying to bring in various experts and knowledge holders to teach us about the nuclear industry, and we're trying to bring as many voices to you as possible. So this could be knowledge holders within the community, scientists, or other communities that may be dealing with similar situations, just so we can kind of learn from them and how they have handled situations. So in today's episode, we're going to be hearing from Kyle and Sara from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and they're going to be talking about what nuclear waste is. So without further ado, I will let Kyle and Sara introduce themselves and get started with the presentation.
All right, thank you, April. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kyle McLean. I'm a site inspector with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and I'm located at our Bruce site office.
So my name is Sara Watt, and I'm a senior project officer in the Waste and Decommissioning Division. I'm also an inspector, and I'm focused on waste. And I'm also with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and I am situated in Ottawa.
So Kyle, before you start, I do just see we do have a comment. So just repeat the organization. So Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or the CNSC. So just to get that out there, but go ahead, Kyle.
Thank you, April. And just before we begin the presentation, Sara and I wish to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the three fires known as Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, and further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, known collectively as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. All right, and I'll now share the presentation. All right, and I'll just ask for confirmation that it's coming okay.
Yes, so I can see that just fine, Kyle.
All right, thank you, April. So to start off with, I'm going to be providing a brief overview about the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So if you're not overly familiar with the CNSC, I'll provide a bit of a background about our operations. And then following which Sara is going to be providing information about the different classifications of waste in Canada, the types of waste common to nuclear generating sites, how the waste is managed, and CNSC's role in providing nuclear regulatory oversight. So to start off with, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is Canada's nuclear regulator and was formed in 2000 under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. The CNSC had replaced what was formerly known as the Atomic Energy Control Board, AECB, and this was founded in 1946. The CNSC's mandate is to regulate the use of nuclear energy and materials to protect health, safety, security, and the environment, to implement Canada's international commitments on the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and to disseminate objective scientific, technical, and regulatory information to the public. And safety continues to be the CNSC's #1 priority. And to provide a bit of more details about our commission. So the commission is an independent quasi-judicial tribunal, which has the powers, rights, and privileges necessary to carry out its duties and enforce its orders. The president of our commission is President Velshi, who was appointed a 5-year term in 2018. Also, as part of our commission, it includes up to 7 members who are appointed by the governor and council for terms for up to 5 years. And all commission members are independent and would be part-time members, with exception of our president, who is full-time. The commission conducts as much business as possible through our public hearings and where and when feasible, in the communities that are most affected by the matter at hand. The public hearings are broadcast live on our CNSC website, and following which archives are available for up to 3 months, and the transcripts of meetings and hearings are also available online as well. After hearings, the commission will make a decision granting licenses to applicants that demonstrate that they are qualified. And these decisions are based off of science and safety. The decisions cannot be overturned by the government of Canada, but are reviewable by federal courts. And next up, to provide a bit of background about our CNSC staff located across Canada. So the majority of our employees would work in our Ottawa headquarters. We also have site offices at each of the nuclear power plants shown here in light blue. And as well, we have regional offices located at each of the locations here in yellow. And lastly, a site office located at Chalk River. So CNSC staff are composed of staff with backgrounds in such fields such as environmental or radiation protection specialists. We have nuclear physicists and engineers. Our scientific, technical, and administrative personnel that compose the CNSC carry out the work necessary to fulfill the commission's mandate. Such examples of functions that CNSC staff perform are conducting research and analysis. We conduct inspections at licensee sites, through which we carry out enforcement if necessary. And lastly, we also, as an example, appear before the commission at proceedings to answer questions. And taking a look at examples of the facilities, activities, and materials that we regulate. Here are a few examples across Canada that we're responsible for. And today our presentation focuses on our waste management activities, and specifically those of which at the Bruce nuclear site. This slide here illustrates the cyclical process at the CNSC. If we use an example, the Bruce nuclear stations went through, or Bruce Power went through license renewal in 2018. A 10-year license was granted, and we're now in the stage of CNSC staff executing our compliance plan to ensure that conditions set out in the license are met. Part of the verification that's performed through this stage is that CNSC staff will inspect and evaluate how licensees ensure compliance with our regulatory requirements. We have on-site inspectors at each of the nuclear power plants to carry out inspections. We also perform independent process evaluations and field inspections based on our compliance plans. We review the licensees' self-reporting, and we follow up with licensees to ensure that corrective actions are implemented. And when necessary, we have enforcement tools that range from requests for licensees to fix a non-compliance up to a certain enforcement, which could result in revocation of licenses. All right, and next up, we just wanted to provide a bit of background about radiation protection fundamentals, as shielding is an important concept that comes up with radioactive nuclear waste. So yeah, I just wanted to outline 3 key principles that are taught, which are time, distance, and shielding, which are mechanisms to protect workers. So for example, with time, looking at ways to reduce the amount of time that workers are exposed to radiation sources. Next up is distance, which involves looking at methods to increase, where possible, to increase the distance between workers and the radiation source to reduce exposure. And lastly, shielding, which is the use of barriers or materials to protect workers from the radiation source. And just to expand on shielding as well, it's dependent on the type of radiation that would be present. And just outlining a few examples here, with alpha radiation, alpha particles are highly energetic, but consist of heavy particles that would only travel short distances and can be easily shielded by thin materials such as paper. Beta particles would be emitted at higher speeds, but again, would not penetrate roughly about a centimeter worth of solid material. Next up, looking at photons or gamma radiation. This is a source which is much more penetrating than alpha or beta, and so would require, here is an example with the use of lead. Another example could be concrete that's used. And lastly, neutrons, which would lose much of their energy through the scattering processes in which water is effective. All right, thank you. And I'm now going to pass things over to Sara for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Kyle. Now that you've heard a little bit about the CNSC, I'm going to provide a general overview of radioactive waste in Canada. I'm going to touch on waste classification, waste characterization, and how waste is generated, handled, stored, and managed. So first of all, waste classification is a categorization of different types of waste and plays a key role in managing all waste streams, including those from operational, decommissioning, and environmental remediation activities. There are 4 classes of radioactive waste in Canada shown on this slide. The first class is uranium mine and mill waste. It's radioactive waste from the byproducts of mining and milling. This includes waste rock or mine tailings. This type of waste will not be discussed further today. However, that could be something for a future webinar topic. Low-level radioactive waste contains minimal radioactive materials. These are such things used for routine cleanup and maintenance, such as gloves, mops, paper towels, and protective clothing. Low-level radioactive waste generally does not require significant shielding during handling and in-term storage, and some low-level radioactive waste may have longer radionuclides, and which would require isolation and containment, probably for up to could be up to a few hundred years. There's another category that I actually don't have on here called very short-lived low-level radio waste, and that's hospitals, universities, industry. So some of the medical isotopes, those have very short-lived radioactivity and takes hours or days with respect to that waste category. So after a couple of days, that is no longer radioactive, and so it doesn't have to be managed in the same way, and it can be disposed of by conventional means. So I wanted to mention it here that does exist, but we won't talk about it anymore after this. So then the other category here is intermediate level waste, which contains higher levels of radioactivity and primarily consists of things like used reactor core components, resins, filters, water systems, cleaning radioactive sources used for radiation therapies. And it's more radioactive than low-level waste and requires some shielding to protect workers from handling. High-level waste consists of used nuclear fuel, and we'll touch a little bit more about low, intermediate, and high-level waste categories in the upcoming slides. One other concept I wanted to mention here was waste characterization. And waste characterization determines the properties of the waste, and it helps to determine the best way to manage waste. So the purpose of waste class, so it helps to devise management strategies, planning, designing, licensing, operating, and for those waste management facilities. It helps to identify the hazards, helps us to determine the type and degree of radiological protection that we need. So, and in choosing the appropriate management processes. So Kyle talked earlier about radiation protection a little bit, and concrete. So if it's something that would require concrete, then we would take that into consideration. So shielding, concrete used in the management. And then also having distinct classification and terminology also helps to facilitate the communication between waste generators and regulators and stakeholders, and making sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about the same things, so that we know when we talk about low, intermediate, high level waste, we're all talking about the same thing. So low level waste. So low level waste contains minimal radioactive materials. And it can include things like we were talking about earlier about routine cleanup things, maintenance, gloves, mop heads, paper towels, maybe protective clothing. It could be contaminated tools that were used. As I mentioned earlier, this category doesn't generally require shielding for handling. And most of it's stored in bags or bins. There's a photo on the left here with some, and these bins are usually stored together in a large warehouse, which is the one in the middle. So the left is some bags in a bin. Those bins are placed in storage in that middle photo. They can have longer lived radionuclides and can require containment and isolation for up to a few hundred years. So so that's low level waste. I did want to mention too that low level waste can, some depending on the characteristics of the waste, it can actually be incinerated. And the Western Waste Management Facility does have an incinerator, and we'll talk a little bit about that in some later slides. So intermediate level waste, it contains, like I said, higher levels of radioactivity than low level waste, depending on their usage. So used reactor components, filters, depends on where it was used. And it does require some shielding during handling and interim storage. It generally needs to be isolated and contained for about, could be 300 to 500 years. And it can be stored in a variety of methods. So there's the photo on this slide. The photo on the left is showing an in-ground storage container. The second picture, so the one on the left is actually at the Western Waste Management Facility, the Bruce site. That middle photo is actually a photo of at the Ontario Power Generation's Darlington nuclear site, and that's the retube waste containers from a current refurbishment project. And those containers are for interim storage until longer term solution can be developed and implemented. But that material is stored at Darlington and is at the Darlington site. So high level waste is the other category. And in general, it's use nuclear fuel for nuclear power plants. So on the photo is when we talk about fuel, that's what it looks like. On the left is actually a photo of a fuel bundle. To give you an understanding of the size, it's about 2 feet long or half a meter and weighs about, I think, about 50 pounds. So just to give you an idea, it looks kind of small in that photo, but that's about how big it is. So in Canada, used fuel is generally stored at the generating station. Once it comes out of the reactor, it goes into this, that photo in the middle on the top is a giant pool, and it's stored underwater for probably 7 to 10 years to cool. At that point, it's then transferred into a dry storage canister, and it can be, sometimes it's a silo. There's different types of concrete canisters. And then they are left in those canisters until we can find a long-term storage solutions developed and implemented. I just want to give a couple of stats here about how much there is in Canada. So in 2019, there was about 12,718 cubic meters of high-level waste. It's a couple of years old, but just to give you an idea for comparison. So the typical volume of an Olympic swimming pool is 2,500 cubic meters. And so that's about 5 swimming pools. And so that's for about 40 years of energy production. We've got that much high-level waste in Canada. So other examples could be from some medical isotopes could be considered high-level waste, or one comment would be for fuel reprocessing waste, but currently in Canada, we don't actually do any reprocessing of waste at this time. So what I wanted to do in the next part was to give a bit of an overview with an example. So in Canada, we have the polluter pays principle. So waste producers and owners are responsible for funding, organizing, managing, and operating the waste disposal facilities. So they're responsible for the waste
Sara,
they produce. Yes?
we just got a comment just before you kind of go into that next slide.
Okay, yeah.
They just want to they would like you to repeat that number. So I think
Which
from
number?
the previous
Which number? Like how much? The 40 years of power generation? Or which number?
I'll just pause.
Do you want me to check the? That's okay. I'll look at the chat myself.
The amount of high-level nuclear waste.
It's approximately 12,000 cubic meters, roughly, when we talk about fuel. I've seen different ways it's just an example to kind of try to visualize how much. I'm just reading the comment too about noticing that the subtitles are sometimes they are wrong, the wrong words. So yeah, I agree. There were some strange ones that came up that I didn't say that word.
Yeah, it's a little distracting.
But does that answer, I guess, for the person that's asking that? Does that make sense? Is that I guess I wanted clarification if that answers your question. Not sure.
Okay. Well, let's continue. And, if the answer doesn't kind of come through.
Yeah, I don't think, she says she's been to the WMF, so you've been to the Western Waste Management Facility. Is that what, yeah, and that would cover, the comment I made there would cover more than just what's at the Western Waste Management Facility. So it would be more, there's multiple stations and there's multiple places. So does that, so it seems like a lot. So if you've been to the Western Waste Management Facility, you've seen how much is there. That's not how much is there. Does that make sense? Does that, maybe that's why the number didn't seem right. Okay, perfect. I know you probably thought 12,000 at Western, that's a lot, but no, that's not just Western. But I'm glad to hear you've been some of the sites, so you'll be familiar with some of the stuff I'm going to present later. So yeah, so what I wanted to, oh, I see. Yeah, I don't have that stat off the top of my head, but I mean, we can always find that for you about how much is actually stored. Let me do a few more slides and maybe that'll help you a little bit because there's a couple of things I want to say with respect to what's specifically, like you said, in your territory. So what I wanted to do, what I brought today is on this next slide is sometimes to understand some of these concepts, it's a lot of information. So I wanted to put it with an example and walk through what's at the Bruce site and also the Western Waste Management Facility, which is at the Bruce site. So just to illustrate the management and storage and how things are done and handled. So I think that'll help and how we do our oversight as well. So the Bruce site on the left, this is the nuclear generating station that you can see there. Kyle, I always get mixed up if this is A or B, but it's one of them. And on the right-hand side, that's a picture of the Western Waste Management Facility. There's a few other, so Douglas Point is also at the Western Waste Management, sorry, I'm getting mixed up, which I'm going to close the chat here. So the Douglas Point Waste Facility is operated by the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. It's also at the Bruce site. It just had its license renewed and it is moving into the decommissioning phases. So I wasn't going to mention, or I don't have it as part of my presentation, but you know, if you do have some questions, maybe we can see what we can do about that later. So there's other buildings at the site as well, but they'd be administrative buildings, offices, and they don't generate radioactive waste. So all licensees must develop a waste management program to help reduce the overall volume of radioactive waste that requires long-term management. So they're expected to investigate and implement new radioactive waste management technologies and techniques as they become available. And some of these strategies could be reusing and recycling of materials, preventing contamination. This is a big one, and we'll talk about a little bit more, is preventing contamination by restricting the amount of materials in certain areas. So also looking at improvements in waste handling facilities and techniques. So, you know, methods to reduce, reuse, recycle, and protecting health and safety of persons are protected. So that's a really important concept. So both these two facilities are not operated by the same, the station is Bruce Power, and the Western Waste Management Facility is actually operated by Ontario Power Generation. They have their own waste management programs, but they would both meet the requirements that we have in our regulations, all the codes and the standards. So they may have different programs, but they're assessed by CNSC staff to ensure that they actually meet the requirements. So I'm going to talk about these activities a little bit more. So this is just, these photos are for illustrative purposes. I think the photo on the middle and the right, I'm not actually, I think I took them from a different station, but it actually helps just to understand what you're looking at. So Bruce Power has low level waste. So we're going to start talking about that first, that we then have low, intermediate, high level waste. So we've discussed some of the typical items that fall under these three categories of radioactive waste, and all of them are applicable to this site. So low level waste, what are we talking about? Mop heads, gloves, plastics, protective clothing. These are all examples of low level radioactive waste that would be generated from operations and activities. So Bruce Power has to characterize and sort that waste. So waste, one of the categories too is we talk about likely clean. So on the right-hand side in that photo, you'll see there's a green garbage can. I should say a green bin. And so then there's also the yellow bin, and depending on the waste characteristics, they'll go into different colored bins. So it's similar to at home. I have a compost bin, I have a box for plastic, paper, regular garbage. And so at the station, they have that kind of different bins for different waste types. So I put different waste in different bins, and then those streams are collected and managed separately by, say, my municipality. So radioactive waste is sorted in that same way. So for example, throughout any nuclear power plant, there would be different bins like this at different locations near work areas. So once work is complete, then a worker would say remove their gloves or protective gear, and then would have to place it in the appropriate container. Then there's waste management staff that come around and actually collect that, that waste, and they would have to, and then it gets sorted a little bit later on. So the green bin here was likely clean. So if I had something, and I was trying to think of examples like packaging materials or the box that, say, the protective gloves came in, I don't think that it's radioactive. It didn't go into an area that was radioactive. So I'm going to put it in that green bin. And then that bag, though, is still going to be collected, and it's going to be confirmed that it's clean before it is taken off site. So there's actually a process in place to make sure. So it doesn't just get thrown in there and assume that it's clean. There is a verification process that happens. So the opposite to that is that if I use gloves, I place them in the yellow bins, and then materials collected in the that yellow bin, we call it active waste. And there can be different types of active waste. So I want to say it's not compostable, sorry, compactable or incinerable, and those kind of types of ways to manage the waste. So it gets collected, it's sorted, and actually those wastes would actually go to the Western Waste Management Facility. And then I think on the left here, we looked at that photo earlier, but that's again, bags in a container. And those would be the same type of low-level radioactive waste. And they could be further sorted in, like I was saying, the compactable, incinerable. So they get sorted that way. So I did want to mention here that site inspectors, we regularly inspect at both Bruce and Western, doing field walk downs and inspections. So we would actually walk through and check and verify that they're actually doing this. And I've gone on an inspection where I've walked with staff who's doing the collection and the checking and making sure that they're doing this that process properly. So I'm going to move on to another example is intermediate level waste. So currently intermediate level waste generated from the Bruce Power Facility could be like used reactor components. So there's the current refurbishment project that's happening for Unit 6. And that's actually what's shown in the photo on the left. Some components are left whole, or they can be placed in into storage. So they could be left whole and put into storage at the Western Waste Management Facility. Other things like tubing and piping could actually be chopped up and placed into smaller containers. And they would be large steel lined, a concrete container. And this is where the aspect of shielding comes in. So the steel and the concrete would provide that shielding. And in this case, they'd be put into a container. So in the middle is an example of a container from the refurbishment project. And then it would be bolted closed. And then on the photo on the right, it's being shipped across the site. That's just from the Bruce to the Western Waste Management Facility for storage. So other types of intermediate level waste in smaller sizes are also shipped over, but this is just a good example to show the process from start to finish. So the other type of fuel is high level waste. And so that's the used nuclear fuel. So we talked a little bit about that in previous slides, how it's put into cooling bays for 7 to 10 years before it goes into the interim storage. So on the left, that's a really big giant pool full of the high level waste. And then after that, after about 7 to 10 years, it would actually be put into what is termed dry storage containers, and it's transported to the Western Waste Management Facility. And with that, I'm going to switch over to the other site, which is the Western Waste Management Facility. So at Western, there's low, intermediate, and high level waste. So this slide is about the storage of low and intermediate level waste. And for starters, the Western Waste Management Facility has a lot of different buildings and operations. So there's a volume reduction building, there's above ground storage containers, there's above ground refurbishment, there's in-ground containers, there's some trenches and tile holes. On the left and the right are both, so when I say tile holes, those are all, both the left and the right photos are in-ground. And so the Western Waste Management Facility is authorized to process and store low and intermediate level waste and high level waste generated from the Bruce nuclear generating site. But it also manages and stores low and intermediate level waste from other Ontario Power Generation facilities. So the Darlington and Pickering, not high level waste, only only fuel at Western is from the Bruce, the Bruce generating stations. So it's important. But for the low-level waste, some of that waste arrives at the Western Waste Management Facility, and they've termed it the volume reduction building. And that's really where waste is sorted. It can be compacted and also put into their incinerator. So the Western Waste Management Facility is an incinerator, and we talked a little bit about characterization and classification. So they don't just incinerate all types of low intermediate of waste. It has to meet the characteristics for it to be allowed. So it has to be, there's some incinerable is the way to put it. So, and then those ashes from the incineration process would then be stored in containers. And so example, the middle is containers that are shown in the middle slides. So the other thing that happens at the Western Waste Management Facility is processing storage of dry storage containers from the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. So they're authorized to process and store high-level waste. They aren't authorized to process or store high-level waste from other generating stations. I want to make sure too, processing doesn't mean there's any like reprocessing. Processing, when I use that term, it has to do with it is strictly talking about welding the DSCs closed and making sure that the seal is correct, and it's that process. So it's not processing the waste, it's processing the DSC. So for illustrative purposes, the dry storage container is on the left, and that shows a cutaway view so you can kind of see what the containers look like. They're metal, they're concrete, they're very heavy. They arrive at the Western Waste Management Facility empty in separate containers, the lid and the base. So I think it's about 40 tons when they're empty, and I think it's about 70 tons when they're full. So the Western Waste Management Facility receives the dry storage containers from the Bruce Nuclear Station. The lid's clamped, and then on the photo on the right is an example of a transporter. It's just one, and that's a vehicle that's able to lift them up and move them. And this at the Western Waste Management Facility, they have one of these to move the DSCs around the sites, the dry storage containers around within the facility. And they have to have their, it's just, these are so heavy, they have to have a special vehicles to transport them. So because loaded, they're 70 tons. And you can see there's a person standing next to it. So it gives you an idea of the size of them. So they're about, I guess, the size of a minivan. I actually think they're bigger than a minivan looking at this photo, but that was one of the examples to describe the size. So also once they arrive, they're processed. So like I said before, they weld the lid to the base. They do some leak testing to make sure, check the integrity of the welds, and then they're placed in one of the storage buildings. And again, we provide oversight to ensure that they're operating safely. We do inspections, we desktop reviews, all kinds of those kind of activities. So the waste is, we've talked about how the waste gets from the station. It's now at the Western Waste Management Facility. The Western Waste Management Facility will have the used fuel and then for interim storage. And then what? So earlier we talked about high-level waste spent fuel, how it's currently being stored safely and managed. And so you might be wondering about what the long-term management of Canada's spent fuel is. So currently, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, also known as NWMO, is assessing a solution for long-term management of that used nuclear fuel. So this slide just shows their concept for a deep geologic repository. And in accordance with the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, the NWMO is responsible for identifying a willing host for the long-term management of that fuel. And that process is adaptive phase management. So, and I believe the South Bruce is actually being considered as a potential site. They are at the pre-licensing phase. We have not received an application, but if anybody's interested, there will be a project update to the April 27th to the commission. So I think that'll be broadcast live. I did just want to bring it up to tie, to tie things off to say that with respect to the used fuel. So that's why I thought this would be a good slide to end on. So with that, that's where I was going to end my presentation to talk about waste. So if there's any questions, this kind of concludes things, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Sarah and Kyle. So
I think I need some water. I was gonna say I need some water. I didn't realize it was that long, so sorry. Lots of things to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's a very large topic, and I'm glad that you two were here to kind of explain those differences between the waste. Yeah. So I didn't see any more questions coming. Oh, we did have one more question.
Okay.
So we have it in the Q&A. So it says, will South Bruce residents have a vote like Son?
So that, I think, is a question for NWMO, I would think, who's going to have that decision. That's up to them.
Mhm.
Like I said, this is in the pre-licensing phase. So CNSC's involvement at this time is really about we call it the pre-licensing phase. So we're just assessing more of the making sure that we're providing regulatory guidance. We're just talking about engaging with the different communities and doing some pre-licensing technical reviews. So that's really where the project's off. We're early phases. So it's a great question. And I would say there's Kyle, you hopped in. Did you want to say something else?
Jump in as well. And I know part of the site selection criteria is that a willing host community is required for the step to go forward for a DPR.
Yeah. And like you have said, they're in the very early stages of this process. So we aren't quite there yet either, but it's something the community does have to decide as well. And I'm sure it may be a similar situation where a vote may happen, but again, we're in the early stages and we're not there yet. So it's something. And
no, sorry, I interrupted you there. But what I was going to say is that it's another one of those topics that we have staff who are engaged in that pre-project reviews, the technical discussions. And if this is an area of interest, I'm sure NWMO is out doing a lot of outreach and engagement, and we have our own team doing that and talking about it from our perspective and our side from the regulatory side. So that's also something that's with this these episodes. I don't know if I want to say episodes or whatever that you're calling them, but that's also, there's an opportunity there to bring somebody who's actually on the ground with this to come and do a similar type presentation and answer questions if they haven't already.
Definitely. So we do have another 2 questions that have popped up.
So I'm going to talk about the Western Waste Management Facility. So it depends on what the type of intermediate level waste. So refurbishment waste, so right now Darlington is undergoing a refurbishment process similar to the Bruce site, and that is waste is the refurbishment waste is being managed and stored at the Darlington site. Other types of intermediate waste like resins maybe also at the Western Waste Management Facility. Yes. Responsibility from. So I think that first question, so today I think we were just here to talk about radioactive waste and the types of waste. But if so I think the role today was from a discussion, presentation of technical materials. So I'm not sure, maybe that's an answer we can take back and answer that at another time. April?
Yeah, so I agree, Sarah. We'll take that question there that we have, the very first question, the responsibility from government to First Nations. We'll take that back, we'll hold that, and we'll get an answer to you. But yeah, the purpose of this today's episode was really just to get a basis understanding of the nuclear waste, just to help us kind of understand it, what it is, know those differences, so we can better understand the paper or the publications that OPG or NWMO would be providing to the community. So that's what the purpose of today's episode really was.
Yeah, this is not consultation. This is not engaged. This is
educational.
Yeah, exactly. Just education. So if you've got questions about waste or anything like that, that's the intent of today. So.
But I will take specific questions. I'll have them noted and we'll look for answers and we will provide those to you. I'll send you most likely in email. I have the answer, but I will have those noted.
Mhm. So the other question is tritium still being transported as well? So I'm not sure that's exact. It's that, so waste would be characterized. Waste could have tritium in it, and then it would be transported. So yes, but it's waste that has tritium. That's does that make sense? So it's not tritium being transported, it's waste, it's characterized, it has tritium, and the waste is being transported. So I'm looking at the thing of that when I say waste, it's actually typing it as waste, like as in my physical waste. So, and I was just saying physical wave, so it's interesting. So yeah. Anything else?
Don't see any more comments or questions.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of everything.
Okay. I hope it was helpful. And if there's other, oh, absolutely. I understand your perspective, Helena.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that we can talk about maybe in a future episode that's more specific to, what's happening here in the territory. But again, we just wanted to provide a general overview to help us understand things a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, and then I hope that you do have a better understanding about what's coming into the territory. So the use, like I said before, it's the used fuel is only from the Bruce generating stations. That's what's at Western. So there's also what we didn't talk about was Douglas Point. So there is used fuel at Douglas Point as well, but they're in the decommissioning process. And so there's some, they're doing asbestos abatement and other kinds of projects to be able to move forward with some of the phases of decommissioning. Did you have any other questions? I hope that was helpful, informative.
What's the combined amount of waste is another question we've just had.
So maybe what I'll get is a bit of a clarification, and we can provide that back to April. So because it depends the type of waste. So there's, it depends on, are we talking about low, intermediate, high level waste? And do you want to know the waste from Western versus the waste from what's at Douglas Point? So, okay, so separately. Okay. Somebody else is responsible for Douglas Point. So I think that one might be a good one that we can, and when you're talking about what's at Douglas Point and what's at the Western Waste Management Facility, you're talking about amounts, but you're talking about amounts of high level waste? Or all kinds of waste? Because they probably don't mind getting those numbers. It's something I don't have the top of my head for both of those. So I don't mind, we can definitely take that back to get those volumes.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I get the right numbers too. So as long as, we could do high level waste at those two, or in a bit of a description of the type of waste at those two facilities. Does that help?
Yeah. So Helena, we'll get those answers to you for the numbers for the Douglas Point and the Western Waste Management Facility.
Yeah.
She does have one final question there. It says, who is responsible for Douglas Point?
Oh, okay, so Douglas Point is actually, so I talked about Bruce Power, I talked about Ontario Power Generation, and Douglas Point is actually the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, so that's CNL. And when I said who is responsible, so there's a different, so at the CNSC, we have different staff and different teams that are responsible. I'm the project officer for the Western Waste Management Facility, so I know a little bit more about that site, but Douglas Point is one of my colleagues that is responsible for that facility and it has a lot more information and understanding about what's happening. So I would really, so CNSC is still a license for Douglas Point. It's just a different licensee.
And that's something as well that we can take back to consider as well if there's interest for a further discussion on Douglas Point. It's did go through its license amendment hearing recently. But yeah, we can again discuss a bit more about the process and where it fits in its decommissioning stages.
Yeah, and April, that's a good point, because they were just the license for, so Douglas Point, they had the renewal hearing before Christmas. And since then they've actually issued the license. And so the next step would be for to move into the actual decommissioning work. And so that might be a good time to come back and talk a little bit more about that work and what that means moving into the next phase.
Yep, that's great. It's always good to have future topics at hand. So that's something well planned.
Yeah, it feels like there's an interest there. And so it's, if there is, then if that's what the community is interested in, then that'd be great.
Perfect. All right, so we're coming up to an hour now. So I'd like to thank Kyle and Sara. I really appreciate you both taking the time to explain those differences between the nuclear waste, explain the purpose of the CNSC, and just covering this topic so we can all have a better understanding of materials that we may get in the community. And I thank you everyone for submitting those questions. I know some were a little more specific, so I will go back to the office and I'll work on getting those answers to you and sending you some emails afterwards. But that does conclude our episode. I really appreciate everyone taking the time this afternoon to join us. I'm gonna post a little contact information in the chat. If you do have further questions or just want to get in touch with the office, you can use that email, call the office, and we'll be back in touch with you. So miigwech, and see you next time.